for the invitation to kickstart this really useful and exciting, informative webinar this morning. And I look forward to hearing the contributions from the expert panel and the discussions that will follow. The title of the session, Our Ocean of Opportunity, is very fitting as someone for whom conservation, climate considerations and marine protected areas are very much at the forefront of my work and that of our department. Let me say that we're now on the doorstep of what Pádraig has described as a very significant opportunity, not just to reimagine our ocean and our relationship with it, not just to restore its biodiversity and ensure greater resilience to society's resource demands and to climate change, but also to rebuild and to reignite our relationships with one another as users, enthusiasts and custodians of the sea. We're still fortunate in Ireland to have a very productive, awe-inspiring and beautiful marine environment. Few would know this better than you yourselves participating here this morning. That environment is under increasing pressure and threat. We must conserve the natural features of the benefits as we, as a society, get from our seas and our ocean now for future generations, so that we and they can inherit a brighter, more sustainable future around this island, one that's in equilibrium with our surrounding ecosystems. In this regard, the government has set itself a number of challenges that have made firm commitments to deliver on marine protected areas, as we set on a new course to meet our existing target of 10% MPA coverage in practical terms as soon as we can, while also aiming for that 30% coverage of the maritime area by 2030. The ambitious programme of work will bring Ireland far beyond our current 2.1% area-based protection in the sea under the EU Birds and Habitats Directives. It involves the development of a new legislation beginning this year, and including for the first time a legal definition for marine protected areas, so that they're a strong, well-managed contributor to achieving the policy goals set out in the programme of government, the European Green Deal, and the EU Biodiversity Strategy of 2030. Part of this work, through the ongoing public consultation on the MPA process, among other things, we're asking, and I'm asking you to tell us, what coastal marine features, including cultural features, you think should be protected, what your concerns and perspectives are, and how we should go about expanding managing our network of protected areas in the short term and in the long term. Just to say, we've had some really positive engagement so far in some public sessions with young people, with the NGOs, with fishers, and we've met with Sea Change in a very colourful demonstration, and Pádraig and Regina outside Leinster House a number of weeks ago. And yesterday, I met with the Irish Basking Shark Group with a fantastic bill that was brought forward by our colleague Jennifer Whitmore. And we're just, hopefully, you know, that apart from the legislative part of or the protection of basking sharks, there is a role for marine protected areas and protection of species such as basking shark, as we've seen in Scotland, and that interconnectedness of those as well. I've read Regina's fantastic article in the IWT magazine on MPAs, and I'd urge people to have a read of that. It's really good. The public awareness work that has been done by IWT over the last number of months has been really useful and helpful to us in our public consultation, and we would really love to get some of the outputs, the qualitative data that you've taken on board from those public sessions and from today to form part of the public consultation process and our reporting on that. We'd really welcome that collaboration on that. This is about positive engagement with the NGO sector in particular as well, and this is about building relationships that work together towards achieving these common objectives. I suppose just to say as well, we'll be on the road ourselves over the next 2 weeks. Some of the work around our tour of the coast will be around marine protected areas. So we'll be meeting with communities, and it's fantastic to have the opportunity to physically meet communities around this. We haven't had the opportunity to date, and I'm really looking forward to that over the next 2 weeks. We're all in this together, and it's a collective responsibility to deliver on this. It's a major undertaking of work. And it doesn't, if it doesn't work for everyone, and it's not going to work at all. You as citizens or representatives interested in protecting Ireland's marine environment, our flora and fauna, our marine heritage, have a vital role to play in shaping the future. And we are on the doorstep of this opportunity now. In opening this dialogue and discussions on MPAs for Ireland here today, let's also open a new way forward together as an island society, one that is inclusive and imaginative and outward looking and delivers workable solutions together.
Thank you very much for that, Minister Noonan, and we wish you well in your work. We know the climate bill is due to be passed very shortly, and you have a lot of work on your plate. So if we don't see you again, we hope you have a very nice summer holiday, and we'll be back to shoulders to the wheel in the autumn. So thank you very much for your contribution. We have a number of speakers for you all now that bring their own different levels of expertise to the issue of marine protected areas. And just to say at the onset, if you do have a question for the panelists as we move through the session, please put it in the Q&A button. Please don't put questions into the chat, because I won't be monitoring the chat, but I will monitor the Q&A. So please, if the question is for any of the particular panelists, please state that and then write in your question. So our first speaker today is Grace Cott. Grace is Assistant Professor at University College Dublin, and she is a coastal wetland ecologist with a special focus on coastal blue carbon. And Grace was a co-author of a really fantastic report on this issue of blue carbon that was published recently. So over to you, Grace, and thank you for joining us.
That's great. Thanks very much, Padraig. So I'm delighted to partake in this discussion today. So I'd just like to give a brief overview of blue carbon. So what is blue carbon? So it's a term that describes the carbon that is sequestered by the oceans, but in particular by coastal vegetated habitats. And so what I mean by that is salt marshes, seagrass meadows, and also mangrove habitats. So we don't have mangrove habitats in Ireland. They're specific to the tropics. And so there are 3 species that inhabit the intertidal zone. But we do have salt marshes and we do have seagrasses here in Ireland. And so the blue carbon concept, it stems back to reports in 2009 by the United Nations Environment Programme. And so what they were doing, they were highlighting the importance of these carbon sinks for climate mitigation. And really, I guess the blue carbon concept, it comes under the umbrella of nature-based solutions, whereby we recognize the role that ecosystems can play in terms of climate mitigation and also adaptation, and really just how important these carbon sinks are. And linked very much with the blue carbon concept is management. So how we can manage, how we can basically protect, conserve and restore these really important carbon sinks. So in particular, I study salt marshes, and I just have a few photographs for you. Just to give you a visual on these particular habitats. So this is a salt marsh in Tralee Bay, so in Derrymore in County Kerry. And these habitats, they're dominated by very specialized vegetation. So it's vegetation that can withstand the salt from seawater, and it can also withstand being flooded by the tide. So you can see here on this photograph, the channels or the creeks that dissect the marsh. So they allow for the tide to flow in, and they also allow the tide to drain out as well. So that's one down in County Kerry. This is in County Donegal, so a very scenic site. This was just taken a couple of weeks ago. So you can see the salt marsh on the lower half. It's flowering at the moment. So that's the sea pink or the sea thrift and the Armeria species flowering there at the moment. So just a beautiful picture there. Here we have a salt marsh down in Barley Cove in County Cork. So if any of you are familiar with this area, the salt marsh has formed behind the beach and behind the dune area. And you can see again that tidal channel dissecting the marsh, allowing for the tide to come in and out and flow over the marsh. So this is just another photo then of a still from drone footage taken at that site in Barley Cove. And so just what I wanted to get across as well really is so that you understand why these habitats are so good at storing carbon. And there's 3 main reasons. So first of all, these habitats or the plants in them are really, really productive. So despite the harsh conditions, the high salinity, the flooding, they actually grow really, really well. And so they are trapping through photosynthesis, they're trapping CO2 from the atmosphere, and that's getting stored then in above ground and below ground, the roots and so on. Another reason is that the plants actually slow down the tide and they allow for sediments to deposit out. So carbon actually builds up in that sense as well. And finally, because these soils tend to be waterlogged a lot of the time, there's very, very little oxygen. And so because there's so little oxygen, it means that the carbon that has built up there doesn't actually decompose quickly. That's similar to a peat bog, for instance, where there's very little oxygen, but it means that carbon builds up and it can get stored over long periods of time. And so they're the three main reasons why these habitats are really very good at storing carbon. And the same applies to seagrass meadows, those three processes, and mangrove habitats as well. And so that's why they're really important sinks, and it's very much on a per area basis that they're so efficient at storing carbon. And so what I'm actually involved in at the moment is getting this baseline data on the carbon stocks of our salt marshes in Ireland. So this summer we're on a campaign, a national field campaign. So we're building up a picture of how much carbon exactly is stored in our salt marshes across the country, and how does that vary geographically, how does that vary with the different substrates that our salt marshes are found on. So that gives you just a little bit of an overview there before I hand back to Pádraig.
Thank you very much, Grace. And I think what your research is absolutely vital, and it's also pointing to how the marine really serves multiple functions. We obviously love the biodiversity of the ocean, but it's so important for carbon, and some of the other speakers will talk about how it's important for culture and community as well. So thank you very much for that, Grace. Our next speaker this morning is Morven Roberteson. Morven is the Senior Projects Manager with the Blue Marine Foundation in the UK, and she manages Blue's UK projects, including the Lyme Bay Fisheries and Conservation Reserve and the Solandt Oyster Restoration Project. Now, Lyme Bay is something people familiar with our work on marine protected areas. We've been doing a lot to promote Lyme Bay and what has been going on in Lyme Bay because it is a model in these islands for marine protected areas. So welcome, Morven, and over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and really pleased for the opportunity to speak. So Blue works all over the world, tackling overfishing and protecting our oceans, but it's really the work that we've done with the fishing community in the southwest of England that's really shaped our approach to managing marine protected areas and helped us prove that fishing can coexist with conservation. So for those of you that aren't aware, Lyme Bay is a really lovely, beautiful area in Devon and Dorset down in the southwest of England. It was designated a marine protected area in 2008 to protect pink sea fans and the reefs that are found there. It's actually really contentious at the time because it completely removed trawling and dredging. Today it remains one of the only marine protected areas we have in the UK where trawling and dredging have been completely removed within MPA boundaries. And although this was an amazing, step in the right direction, it did have an unintended consequence. And right after the designation, it saw a huge increase in other types of fishing, predominantly potting. It was a really lovely, safe space for everyone to move into and start working in. And it was really that increase in potting that saw local fishermen come together and approach Blue and others to say, we're actually really concerned about this. We're concerned that the MPA might not recover in the way that we want it to and it's meant to. We're also concerned about our fish stocks and they might be going down under this kind of pressure and our livelihoods. And it was together with the fishermen that Blue brought scientists, the local regulators, other stakeholders together to form a working group to actually find a solution to this problem. So we've been working through that working group now, I think for like over 10 years. We meet every 3 months. So that's a lot of meetings over the last 10 years. And together we've really made a commitment to work together to tackle some of these problems and manage the marine protected area together. Through that working group, led by the fishermen, we actually came up with a code of conduct to set limits on the different fisheries within the reserve. These are all small scale fishermen, 10 meters or so, fishing kind of mixed fisheries. And we also put a lot of time and investment into long-term monitoring projects, research to actually look at the kind of interventions that we made and make sure and see whether they're working. We also spent a lot of time just speaking to fishermen, you know, what do you want out of this marine protected area? How can it benefit you? And on the back of that, put a lot of money into investing in chiller units, ice making machines, and even a seafood label to kind of promote the fish. Not only did we now have fish being caught in a responsible way, but the fish was a lot higher quality, so we could promote it as a premium product. 10 years on, I'm delighted to say that Lyme Bay has had some incredible results. We've got 22 times more pink sea fans, we've got 4 times more flora and fauna, and we did a really big project with the fishermen to look at potting and showed that not only is the level of potting that they're fishing at within the code that they came up with sustainable in terms of the reef, but we've got 4.5 times more lobsters as a result. So that kind of research is so important for fishermen to be able to say, hey, you know, we're actually able to operate in this MPA and work alongside it. I think for me, one of the best results that I've, you know, been able to be a part of in Lyme is a piece of research looking into well-being that said that fishermen part of this working group, the scheme, had the lowest levels of stress compared to other fishermen who are not part of these conversations or, you know, able to take an active role in management. I think it's really that forum, bringing fishermen in, allowing them to put forward their ideas, doing the research on their boats. There's created a lot of ownership and kind of almost self-enforcement in a way as well. I'm now really fortunate to spend my time traveling around the UK working with other fishermen, and I'm always amazed when I turn up in a new MPA and I ask the fishermen, what do you want? And they say, we have never been asked that. And I think for everyone who's just starting this journey, for you guys, this is probably the biggest thing I would say, is get out and involve fishermen, allow them to be involved in the management of marine protected areas, because it is absolutely essential that they can benefit from MPAs and, you know, work alongside those protecting the marine environment at the same time. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for that, Morven. Your work has been really inspiring to us, and for anybody who's interested in more of this, we have a link on our website to the YouTube video. I think it's about 20 minutes long, about the road to recovery on what the story of Lyme Bay. And I suppose as somebody, you know, with work obviously coming from a biodiversity, you know, wildlife protection and conservation has been so much about conflict over the last decades. You know, really the sweet spot is where we get fishermen looking for the MPAs themselves and, you know, asking for these things. So I think we can learn an awful lot from what you've done. So thanks very much for that, Morven. Our next speaker this morning is closer to home. It's Ruth Brennan, who is with Trinity College in Dublin, and she's the principal investigator for the Co-Sustain Collaborative Sustainable Innovation, co-designing governance approaches for sustainable and innovative small-scale fishing industry in the Irish Islands. And Ruth was one of the authors of the expert report into marine protected areas that was delivered to government earlier this year. So nice to see you again, Ruth, and thanks for coming along this morning, and over to you.
Thanks a million, Pádraig. Thank you for the invitation to speak again at this. I'm just going to share my screen and oh, that's the wrong one. Let me go back and share again. Stop share. Oh, there we go. Yes, I have. Can you see slides, or Pádraig?
Yes, I can see the map of Barra. Yeah.
Oh no, you can see the map of Barra. Okay,
yeah.
So that's not the right one then. Let me. Can you see a slide now?
I'm still seeing the map.
Okay, let me go back and share this again then. Sorry about this. Okay. Can you see a slide?
We can see a slide, MPA process, yeah.
Yes, brilliant. Sorry about that.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so there were 2 main points that I wanted to make, which I think are quite complementary to the previous speakers, because it adds to kind of the very complex picture of the kind of whole what marine protected areas are and the process of putting them into place. The first point I wanted to make is that the process of creating marine protected areas is as important, if not more important, as the end result, because that will determine who exactly is on board and whether they are actually effective or not. And the second point that I want to make is that as part of this process, it's really, really important to frame people and nature as intertwined, to frame us as part of the ecosystem, as part of the environment, because often we will see, say, the social, environmental, economic dealt with as these kind of separate boxes in policy, and it, particularly the kind of the people versus nature binary, can be really, really unhelpful when it comes to areas as kind of emotive as conservation and marine protected areas. But I'm just going to first of all talk about the importance of process. And the reason the process is really, really important, and if anybody has looked at the marine protected area report, you'll notice that there is a real focus on the importance of the inclusivity of the marine protected area process. And the reason that we did this is because whenever we draw boundaries on maps, and maps are extremely kind of political things, drawing boundaries can create exclusions. So we need to be thinking about whose voices are being heard or not being heard, who has more resources or authority to actually have their voices heard in these processes, and to actually think about this from the start of the process. And this is key to getting people on board, as Morven was saying in relation to fishermen, asking people who might not normally be included, well, what is it that you want and how do we get you involved? And as part of this process, we are talking about marine protected areas, yes, which are protecting biological diversity, but we also really need to think about the foundation of this is actually relationships. We're talking about management. We're talking about management of humans rather than the environment, because we're managing human relationships. And these relationships are key. And the context in which marine protected areas are created are unique. So we need to be very, very aware of the social cultural context of marine protected areas. And that involves really, really fundamental and engagement from the outset with communities who are going to be related to those marine protected areas, particularly when we're talking about marine protected areas in the inshore rather than the offshore areas. And this community involvement has to be properly resourced for it to actually happen. I don't think that we should be expecting people to give their time for free if we're expecting people to be fully involved in implementing marine protected areas and actually engaging in this process. So that resourcing of community involvement needs to be there. Oh, now my slide isn't going to move. Okay, so let me stop sharing. I'm going to have to start share again. Share. Sorry about this. Okay, so if I go into my PowerPoint and put it back to the end show, yeah, and then I can share that screen. And share again. Okay. Yes, so I'll do it this way. So the second point I wanted to make was, as I was saying, about how it's really important to frame humans and nature, or culture and nature, as intertwined and not separate, to avoid this kind of polarization of humans against nature, us or them, having to make that kind of binary choice, which is really not helpful when it comes to marine protected areas, which fundamentally are about the intertwining of humans and nature. And one of the ways we tried to address this in the report was through the concept of biocultural diversity, which is a concept that might not be familiar to people. So I just wanted to give a very kind of brief explanation of what it is. And biocultural diversity basically recognizes that biological and cultural diversity depend on each other and shape each other. And biocultural diversity is talking about how things like human knowledge, how our language, how our practices, how our storying of the world that we live in are intertwined with nature. And as we shape nature, nature shapes us. And one of the, and it's a concept that theoretically might be kind of difficult to grasp. It's like, well, how does this kind of manifest in practice? And some research that I was doing about 10 years ago, one of the things that I created with the community in Barra alongside a visual artist was an interactive online cultural map of the sea, which I am now going to show you. And I just want to play a video extract from a fisherman who was talking about the lobsters that he caught on a wreck, and he had called these lobsters the rusty lobsters because they were living on the wreck. And this will kind of give you an idea of what I mean when I talk about how intertwined people are with the sea. So I'm going to share now my other screen here. That will hopefully work here. Here we go. And hopefully you'll be able to hear the sound on this.
A mate of mine down the road, and he had the krills out, so he put them around this wreck to sink out there during the war, whatever it was. The Cullen was the name of it. So the next day we went out and we lifted the pot, and we got 2 lobsters, and they were brown as that dough, because they were living in the wreck. See? They must have been there for maybe for years, maybe coming out to get in their feed and then back into the That's how the work, that's killing there, yeah. Two of them. And that's on a big tide, you see the bow of that column up there. But you sort of see what, you know, you can see a good bit of the bow.
Yeah, so that's it. So yeah, in summary, my key point is that we need to focus on relationships, the importance of human nature relationships, and foregrounding those to make sure that an unhelpful binary of kind of pitting one against the other isn't set up.
Thanks very much for that, Ruth, and I think that social science perspective of it, I think, is really essential. And you know, historically, I think we'd all agree that it has been undervalued when it comes to conservation, and I hope we see it as a central plank to how we roll out marine protected areas. So thanks for that again, Ruth. Our final speaker this morning is Jean-Luc Solandt. Good morning to Jean-Luc, and he's the Principal Specialist in Marine Protected Areas with the Marine Conservation Society in the UK. And Jean-Luc provides technical and policy advice on all matters to do with the UK and overseas marine protected areas. And I think Jean-Luc was involved in some way. I think he was a reviewer of the expert report on marine protected areas. So he does have some knowledge of what we have been doing here in Ireland. So over to you, Jean-Luc.
Thanks very much. I hope I can be heard. Yeah, so delighted to be invited to this interesting session. It's encouraging that Ireland is going the way of developing ideas for new MPA networks. Just some salient points from MCS and our understanding of MPAs and whether they're going to work or not. In the first place, MPAs that are protecting seabed features really must have bottom trawling excluded from them in order to be a starting point for MPAs that are going to provide any sort of ecosystem services to society as well as to biodiversity. Now, a warning, the Marine Conservation Zone regulations in the UK and our Natura 2000s are very much wedded to the ecological benefits of sites. Whereas we're starting to see much more interest, quite rightly, from science in blue carbon and also other ecosystem services, and valuing those ecosystem services such as nutrient recycling and shoreline protection, as we heard from some of the talks just now about what fantastic work salt marsh does to protect our shorelines. And we have to account for those other ecosystem services in management of MPAs such that we understand we are going to have to make some people not very happy with these decisions. And the sector which I don't want to see, but I think should inevitably be unhappy in the short term will be the bottom-towed fishing gear sector. This is an unfortunate truth of marine protected areas that will function to serve society better. And in order to make such representation understood by stakeholders in any government-funded process to understand stakeholder input into this, we have to see proper representation of the entirety of society in marine MPA management. And that will require really good socioeconomic evidence of the impacts of all activities in those spaces. If those were to come to fruition as well as the time of designation, we will see that there has to be some obvious management for the betterment of society. MCS has a track record in this, as some of you know. We worked with Client Earth to try and push the legislation for European marine sites in 2008 to 2012, which resulted in a revised approach to management of European marine sites, as well as implied management for upcoming marine conservation zones. And sadly, we've only seen about 3% protection from bottom-towed fishing gear within that process, even though 50% of our sites coastally in England's waters are in marine protected areas of one form or another. So you can see that because of a lack of proper accounting of ecosystem services for the benefit of society, we have still a massive problem in making marine protected areas work for anyone other than the continued status quo of if it's been open to bottom-towed fishing gear, it should be towed over. Similar results have occurred in Scotland over their MPA processes, where we've seen only 1.5% of the areas that were open to bottom-towed fishing gears being closed to that sector. So if we are going to make the seas more productive, if we are going to make the seas work for us in terms of climate, if we're going to make the seas more rich on the seabed, which provides nutrient recycling and essential fish habitat to big fish, not just nephrops and scallops, we have got to stop this most pervasive of activity, bottom trawling. So my salient points are, you must stop bottom trawling in marine protected areas to make them worthwhile at all. And secondly, have a proper socioeconomic accountancy of those measures to make sure that they work in the mind's eye of the public that will then support this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Jean-Luc. And I suppose it does point to the fact that obviously in Ireland, we are way behind in the designation process. Lots of countries are way ahead in the designation process, but designation doesn't mean management. So it doesn't mean that we're getting what has been sold to us in a way. And so obviously we don't want paper parks. And I'm sure we'll probably come back to that theme. I can see some of the questions coming in already. So I want to thank all the speakers. I'm going to open it up to the floor now, as it were. We've already had some questions in the Q&A, but please do continue with your questions. And before I go to our audience, I guess I have a round of questions from myself that I would like from some of the panelists. And Grace, I'll go back to you first, please. And the blue carbon thing seems to be in its infancy in comparison to other greenhouse gas accounting and so on. Can you give us your assessment as to where we are in terms of accounting for blue carbon within, let's say, the climate bill or the Paris Agreement, etc.?
Yeah, so it certainly is in its infancy in Ireland, but even around the world, I mean, there are still few countries that have accounted for the carbon that are in their coastal ecosystems. But just to kind of separate out, I suppose there was a question there in the chat about kelp forests and seaweeds, and they are important carbon sequesters, and they really are. So they sequester lots of carbon. It's not really an issue, but sort of the challenge, I guess, with them is actually trying to account for them. It's just more complex. So when I mentioned earlier that the blue carbon concept gained momentum specifically for those three coastal habitats, is because it's linked to management, and you can manage the carbon that is there. So it's being sequestered in situ as such, right in that habitat. The carbon is building up. And therefore you can manage. If you protect that area, then you protect the carbon that's in it. A little bit different to kelps and seaweeds. Obviously they grow very large, they're sequestering lots of carbon, but then when they die off, they can get transported out to sea or onto the shore. And so it's harder, it's more challenging, it's more complex to actually account for the carbon. Where does it end up in the end as such? Where does it get stored? So we know where it gets stored with our coastal vegetated habitats. It happens right in that habitat. So, but getting back to your point in terms of Ireland, we're now, so I'm getting this summer the sort of baseline data set on carbon stocks in our salt marshes. We can use that going forward in our greenhouse gas national inventory, but that is still a little way down the line. Countries that have used it are in the USA and Australia, so they are currently accounting for the carbon that's stored in their coastal vegetated habitats. In terms of just a broader question, blue carbon at large in the oceans, and as I said, our kelps and our seaweeds, that's more difficult to account for, but it can be used in terms of climate adaptation and in our nationally determined contributions. And again, there are some countries that are using blue carbon at large kind of in their nationally determined contributions, but it's still probably a little bit away yet in Ireland. But we're kickstarting that, getting the initial scientific data that we need to go forward with it.
Thanks for that. And Jean-Luc was talking there about bottom trawling in marine protected areas. And of course, there was pretty high profile research published earlier this year that shows that bottom trawling releases as much carbon dioxide as the aviation industry. And obviously that is a prevalent form of fishing around Ireland. I mean, how do we even start to account for that, do you think? What work needs to be done?
Yeah, so I mean, we know on Jean-Luc's point that that bottom trawling is very detrimental. So if you think of a habitat, if it's left like to function optimally, so if it is just able to store that carbon, and then if you bring in some disturbance, so in the case of bottom trawling, this mechanical disturbance that allows for oxygen to get into the sediments, it allows for the resuspension of the sediments into the water column, and that can all reduce the carbon, and it can emit carbon into obviously the oceans at large and then further on into the atmosphere. So that's the problem. So any mechanical disturbance will cause the habitat to degrade and not function optimally. So with, like Jean-Luc's point, it's stopping that that activity is the best thing to do. And in terms of Ireland, it's identifying, well, where are these carbon hotspots in the sediments? And again, that is work that needs to get done. And again, the marine geologists would be part of that, as I'm not a coastal wetland ecologist, but so we need to identify where in Ireland are those carbon hotspots, get that empirical data, and then, you know, you can align where the areas that cannot be bottom trawled need to be.
If I could interject, thanks, Grace. I think the recent research from CFAS, government scientists, and from university, I think Heriot Watt, which we've looked at in our work, has shown that the nearer you are to shore and the more fine the sediments are, the more carbon will be locked into geogenic origin of sediments. So that's basically muds. We shouldn't touch muds with trawls. So we've got a big problem with the Nephrops fleets, frankly, because they want to target the muds because they tend to be lesser in their spatial footprint than sandy areas in our offshore environments. So we have a conundrum there. Are we going to really tackle this in terms of carbon storage potential or not? And also going beyond the actual geogenic aspect of the carbon storage just in the sediments, we've also largely denuded the actual biomass on the seabed, which sequesters carbon rather than just stores it. So it's actively in its productivity storing carbon in the tissues of organism daily life processes. So by feeding, living, regenerating, all those processes store carbon actively. So by reducing our horse mussel beds and our blue mussel beds and our fan shell reefs that we've done over 100 years of trawling, we have degraded the opportunity to actually actively store these assets. And that depresses me and also gives me grounds for enthusiasm and hope that we see from Lyme Bay, where the sedimentary areas are protected. You get sedimentary habitat being much richer, which begets much more carbon capture. So we're not just doing MPAs for biodiversity anymore. We're doing MPAs for societal gain in the fight against climate change. And we've got to impress that upon stakeholders. Sorry to ramble on.
That's fine. It's a very good point, and I suppose it does show us that, you know, if we're looking at the, let's say, the best areas for biodiversity and the best areas for carbon, we find that we are going to be in conflict with fishing interests. I mean, it stands to reason, of course, the fishing boats have been going to the most productive areas for a very long time, and so there is going to be a conflict there, which is a question I had, and maybe Morven, I'll go to you for this, because, you know, your story about Lyme Bay, I mean, it sounds, you know, it sounds easy from this remove, you know, and I know that you guys have been working on this for over a decade, and it wasn't so easy in the beginning. So could you talk to us a bit about how maybe you got fishers on board, and what, you know, maybe you took some wrong turns along the way that we could learn from?
Definitely. So I mean, it definitely wasn't all plain sailing. So I mean, even before the MPA got designated in 2008, it was 25 years, I think, of work gathering the evidence to map the pink sea fans, the reefs, start to talk about what kind of management. There was voluntary management in place to begin with to remove the scallop dredges, and that fell through, which triggered a kind of regulation response. So I think, you know, it's taken a long time to get to where we wanted to go. Even when Blue got involved and started working with fishermen, we were working with the fishermen who remained in the area, small scale, using static gear, pots, set net, rod and line. The dredgers and the trawlers had almost already been removed. So, you know, the socioeconomic work that we have done, yes, definitely showed that a sector of the fleet was displaced and had to move to another area. And we kind of worked with the majority of the fishermen. I guess through our working with the fishermen that remained, we've tried to focus on proving that they can earn more, fish less, and have a positive impact on the marine environment. And if you are going to create marine protected areas and move certain fishing gears around, that needs to be done in conjunction with a complete overhaul in the way that we manage fisheries around our coasts in terms of supporting a transition to more sustainable low impact methods. And they need to happen at the same time. Marine protected areas with the right level of protection, but also sustainable fisheries and support for fishermen to make that transition. And, you know, without one or the other, I think that, you know, there will undoubtedly be displacement, and you'll move the effort on to other areas. So, you know, I think through our work, we've really learned that, yes, it's important to work within MPAs, but you need to be impacting the entire area, the whole seascape that you kind of have responsibility over.
And what was that? I mean, presumably when an NGO marched into Lyme Bay, you know, you weren't greeted with fanfare and flags. So, you know, what, and presumably there was a lot of work done then to try and build trust. I mean, was there a kind of a tipping point, or what was the key moments, do you think, that got fishers on board?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we first arrived, it wasn't me, but some people who still work for Blue were there. I think we almost fell in the harbour at the first meeting. You know, the fishermen were just about to kind of chuck us over the side and tie us up in a krill pot. You know, marine conservationists from London, like, get out. But, you know, after, you know, a year of conversations, just willing to show up, I think, willing to show up at the right time, meeting fishermen off boats, being determined to say, no, we're here again. And, you know, we actually want to know what you want. And I think it's figuring out how we can make that MPA work for the fishermen. Funding, someone mentioned, really making sure there's funding to help fishermen be involved. So a lot of Blue's work has been fundraising to make sure that science can happen on their boats. You know, we talk about the problems. They might want to do something on spur dog and we want to do something on something else, but finding even one project that we agree on that we can do together and take their knowledge and feed into it. I think that's the turning point where we really saw fishermen were like, oh, you're coming on our boats, and oh, you're listening to our ideas. Oh, maybe you're not completely against us then. Maybe we can do something. But unfortunately, it just takes a huge amount of face-to-face, and COVID undoubtedly is causing a lot of problems in respect to that kind of work at the moment. You know, you need to be able to see the whites of each other's eyes, I think, to make progress.
Yeah, but obviously, it just goes to show that a lot of hard graft involved, really, which there's no substitute, there's no shortcut for that, is there?
No, yeah, it's hard work.
And maybe I'll go to you, Ruth, because you have been working with island communities in Ireland over the last number of years, and I'm wondering, maybe you could give us a bit of a perspective from their point of view, and particularly, I mean, fishing, like many industries, suffer from a lot of inequality. And is there an opportunity here, maybe with conservation, that we can also address inequalities in the fishing industry? Ruth, that's it.
I just cut off a little bit at the end of that. Yeah, I'll preface this by saying I can't talk for island communities. So my research was involving island communities, but I certainly can't talk for island communities. I would say within if I'm talking about the small scale island fishing industry, I would see that there are a huge amount of difficulties there in terms of a dwindling industry, in terms of the fish species that they're able to target becoming ever more specialized. And Bordisky Vara has done research on this and recognized that, like, 20 years ago, they were targeting a wide range of fish, a mixed fishery, and now it's basically down to shellfish for the inshore fleet generally, not just for island fisheries. So there is a huge issue of equity in relation to actually being able to access particularly the more valuable quota stocks. And because of that, anything that is perceived by, say, small-scale fishing communities to possibly pose another barrier of access to their fishing, or to impact on their fishing industry, which is already difficult enough to keep alive, there is going to be a huge amount of suspicion around that. And I think just to pick up on, and this is why the relationship building is so important, and it takes so long, and to pick up on what Morven said, yes, people are not, particularly in the small scale industry, they're not used to being asked what they think. And they're not used to being asked really to get involved and really to being listened to. So there is that level of going back again and again and again and saying, no, really, we want to listen to you. Really, we want to listen to you. I think in I remember a quote from one of my interviews, and it wasn't actually from a fishing community. It was somebody in the policy environment. Used to being kicked, you will always expect a kick. So you have to get beyond that, and we have to understand that in terms of kind of community in the past, that hasn't necessarily been there. So there is that obstacle to overcome in the very, very start. And I think that's also why that, like, or you were mentioning like designation, that Ireland is kind of quite behind in the process, and the Marine Protected Area team and government is being very, very careful as to how this process is rolled out, because the foundation is absolutely crucial. And a lot of the times in these processes, and again, as Morven will probably know, it looks like nothing is happening. And there is an awful lot going on behind the scenes. And there are very, very careful steps being put in place to make sure that the process is inclusive. So a lot of this work isn't necessarily work that you can kind of publicize or put out front or have a big fanfare about it, because it's very delicate kind of work to kind of get involved, people involved when there is so much kind of suspicion and fear around it, really. And just to pick up, I was just looking through the questions in the chat that somebody had asked me about whether I thought that fishermen or like farmers should be paid in relation to MPAs. And again, I would say, just like I said, I can't speak for island communities. I would say, well, that's a question for fishing communities. And I deliberately say fishing communities rather than fishermen, because the fishing industry is not just men in boats. The fishing industry is entire communities. If we didn't have women in fishing, we in fishing communities, we would not have a fishing industry. So that question is for fishing communities. It would be a question is, what do you think? What support? I firmly believe that there needs to be state support. There needs to be government support as part of this MPA process for involving and engaging communities, but we need to ask people, what kind of support is it that you need? So I will always be very, very reluctant to say, yes, this is the kind of support, because it will depend on the local sociocultural context. So we really need to ask people these kind of questions who are actually living this.
Thanks for that, Ruth. So it is all very fine-tuned. It's location dependent, and it's dependent on the people you're talking to, and maybe even the time that we're talking to them. So it is nitty-gritty stuff. Jean-Luc, I will pick up maybe a point there that Ruth might have alluded to about the potential conflict between the smaller scale fishing side of things and no-take zones. I see this conflict because the science is clearly showing that for best results for biodiversity and ecosystem recovery, it's no-take zones that we need to be going towards. Whereas those three words do strike fear into the heart of the fishermen, because obviously they don't want to see their traditional grounds being just shut out to them, and the exclusion that Ruth was talking about. Can you give us an idea of how we might navigate those waters?
Yeah, you have no trawl MPAs inshore and you don't have no take zones. It's pretty simple. The government of England is currently reviewing an HPMA process for setting up 5 pilot HPMAs. Highly protected marine areas, effectively no take zones. And our position as an organisation is we will disenfranchise the small guys who can only go out on a day, maybe fish in an area of about 2 square kilometres with a small boat under 10 metres. If we're going to make a no-take zone in their ground, they're not going to be able to go anywhere. And those fishers who are operating pots, traps, set nets and lines, as long as the nets aren't too long, and as Morven has said, as long as the density of pots and traps isn't too much, fine. You're not going to really upset the biodiversity of the seabed. You're not going to really affect the natural capital of the seabed and the ecosystem services of the seabed. What affects the seabed is bottom trawling. It's really as simple as that. So we need probably no-take zones further offshore where fleets can operate for days and days and days. They operate with great profit margins. They operate with reduced fuel costs because they get red diesel. Well, they do in the UK, so they're not paying tax on diesel, so they're getting subsidised. Fish has to be more realistically expensive for the consumer, and that money maybe is put back into, as Ruth has alluded to, compensation for fishers, rather than, you know, funding diesel for these extraordinary trips. I mean, there was a boat that went out of Plymouth the other day. I heard its fuel bill was £20,000, you know, for one trip. That's £20,000 of diesel being put into the atmosphere. So these are inefficient forms of fishing. You know, scallop dredging, you catch only about one scallop every 3 passes. It has to be passed over, you know, you only get a 30% hit rate on scallop dredging, because you're going to kill other animals, and other animals are going to left on the seabed. These are inefficient means by which we are fishing and exploiting the biomass of the sea for public benefit. So as long as we can get those sorts of discussions into your stakeholder processes, that there are two, as Ruth says, there are different types of fishing activity going on with different types of profit margins and different types of loss to society or gain to society. And I totally concur with Ruth and Morven, who talk about the socio-cultural importance of an industry coastally, but that, I think, has been decimated by bottom trawling. And as we closed in Scotland the 3 nautical mile limit in 1984, because we're concerned about the common fisheries policy, and so we had trawling within 3 nautical miles, that disenfranchised the coastal communities of places like Arran, where there's a really good discourse around what the communities used to have in terms of angling competitions and much richer whitefish fisheries. So we're talking about a very simple thing here. We've got to control bottom trawling, and MPAs is as good a place to start as any.
So just as unclear, Jean-Luc, what is your line then on no-take zones in the near shore area? Is it that I don't want to put words in your mouth. So just explain to me where is the place for them, or is there a place for them?
There is a place for them where those communities that are using low impact gears support them. Otherwise, don't bother. And they're probably going to be very small, particularly in reef areas. So in reef areas, they can be small and adjacent to reefs, and they can contribute to really good increase in lobster numbers, large lobsters that are then more fecund, as fishers know. Same with crab, and same with scallop. I mean, the scallop, and you know, there's 3-dimensional capacity increase of fecundity related to size as things grow in natural systems. So you get many, many more eggs per increase in size unit 2-dimensionally of these species. So it makes sense to the fishery, really, to have small, local, no-take zones, but only if they agree. And why are we wasting our energy if we have to do hugely complex and socially disruptive stakeholder engagement with no-take zones when we really have this big problem with bottom trawling? I would think, yes, there's benefit for no-take zones and highly protected marine areas, but really they are, I think, a tool for fisheries management offshore and ecosystem management offshore. Inshore, they're more a small tool that's not going to change the face of the earth. I'm a bit of a big picture guy compared to Morven and Ruth, who are talking about local small coastal communities. There is value in it, but on project scale, but it's very expensive, and you probably need some private funding to get it done properly, and probably a timescale of 5 to 10 years. I'm trying to repair the sea in a generation with, in my mind, with this bottom trawling obsession, if you like it. And they're very different things. So think of that as what you will. There are rooms for highly protected marine areas or no-take zones, but they have to have community support inshore. Offshore, we should have highly protected marine areas, really, in all our MPAs.
Thanks for that. I'm going to, we have a participant here, Oliver O'Kayla, and I'm going to promote you, Oliver, as a panelist, if you don't mind. Oliver is from the Department of Housing, Heritage and Local Government. Oliver, are you there? Just to confirm, you're out there. Can you hear me? No. Okay. I was going to ask Oliver about the government's plans for rolling out the recommendations in the report. Anyway, if Oliver.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, you're there.
Sorry, just took a little while to press the connect button and then for the internet to work.
Cool.
So
cool.
yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
Thanks for coming on, Oliver. And I know that the department did quite a lot of public consultation in the run-up to preparing this report. So can you give us your view of how this is going to roll out once the public consultation is finished at the end of this month?
Sure. The first step really will be to compile all the submissions that we've received. So we've received several hundred at this point, I can say. The majority of those so far are the online survey form, which is still available obviously till the end of the month. But we have quite a number of email submissions. So we're going to have all of that material independently analysed and reported on. So that's the first step. And then we probably in parallel with that process, so in the autumn beginning straight away, essentially from September onwards, mid-August, September onwards, we'll also then start to consider the key parts of future legislation. So as we've committed to, we'll be begin developing legislation this year. So we'd hope to have it depends very much on how much content we get through the submissions and through the consultation, and we still have 2 weeks to go. But we intend to produce a synthesis and analysis of both quantitative and qualitative of what comes in through the public consultation and present that in the form of a report by the end of the year. That's the plan.
And I suppose the question about legislation is really one for the politicians, but will the department be, presumably the department won't be waiting for legislation to start working on it. Can you give us an idea maybe of the things you might be prioritising?
Yeah, well, I suppose we have some ideas and we're gathering ideas, and we haven't really committed to any particular strand just yet. But from a practical point of view, there obviously has to be a role for science in developing, identifying and proposing sites. There has to be, as we've heard this morning, a very strong role for communities and participation by the public and sectors, and also, part of our thinking and part of the recommendations of the expert group report are to build management in at the start, rather than have a process of designation and then have management actions and measures come afterwards. We have to think about that as well at the beginning. So I suppose it's not a very clear, crisp picture at this stage. We're still very much in the focus of communicating to people to please give us their views and get their words on a page and get them into us. And I think that will help inform some of the key decision-making pieces around engagement, around what features should be conserved, around the value of OECMs, for example, which is a key question we're seeking answers from the public on. These other effective area-based conservation measures, and so on. So I suppose we sort of have three, it's almost like three lottery balls. We have the science one, we have the participation in community and socioeconomic one, and of course they speak to each other. And then we also have the management one as well. And these three, and the place for these three, and how they interact and how they support an advice stage as well for government to take action. All of those are obviously key parts of the process. And of course, we have also asked the question on the systematic conservation planning approach. That's one of the key recommendations of the expert group report. What do people feel about that? Is that the process that they want? And if so, is it in that order, or are there other things that they would prioritize coming first, and so on? So there's an awful lot there to consider and to be informed on. And we're very happy, I'll stay quiet in a second, but we're very happy to see hundreds of submissions being made. And I think in this forum, I think one thing I might usefully say as well is that some of the email submissions we're receiving are very standardized. So we're getting the same opinion multiple times. And I think it would be valuable as well to your members and your networks as well if we can get individual submissions, if people can take the 10 or 15 minutes to actually think about particular questions and address those the way we're asking them to. So the more the better, really, and tell all your network members and your friends and family and so on to engage. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Oliver. And yes, indeed, we do intend to spend the next 2 weeks getting as many people engaged as possible. I think the numbers do matter as well as the content of the submissions. So thanks again for that contribution, Oliver. Guys, we've got maybe 10 minutes left, and I wanted to go to some of the questions maybe that we haven't covered already, and maybe this will be kind of a quick fire round of questions. But Grace, if I can go to you, I have a question here from Tom, who has asked, in terms of blue carbon, how do you see this interacting with the work on natural capital and the work that they are doing?
Yeah, so I mean, in the next couple of years, we see that interaction as being quite strong. So basically trying to value, trying to quantify what are the socioeconomic values with salt marshes, with seagrass beds, and also looking at the natural capital in terms of biodiversity. So there is a Marine Institute funding call, so they are keen to fund this type of research, and hopefully it will produce data on that. So basically, exactly his question, linking up the natural capital with particularly socioeconomic and biodiversity aspects with these carbon sinks.
Thanks very much for that. There's a number of questions there about, you know, accounting and the UNFCCC and all of these things. And certainly from my own point of view, I hope these big meetings that are happening over the next 6 months or so will have a stronger focus on the ocean. I have another question there about enforcement, and maybe I'll give that to you, Morven, please, because we know with the best will in the world and the best community engagement that the rules ultimately have to be enforced. And can you give us an idea how that is done in Lyme Bay?
Yeah, definitely. So in Lyme Bay, we're very, very lucky. We fall within the Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority districts. So they are inshore regulators, which essentially can create their own bylaws and do their own enforcement. So Lyme Bay is managed by 2 of them. And we're very lucky that because they are local regulators, we have a really high level of enforcement and monitoring. I think as well, because the fishermen are very bought into the scheme, it's essentially their code of conduct. And even though it's voluntary, we've seen other boats come up from elsewhere. Oh, heard the fishing's good in Lyme Bay, I'll go give it a go. Turn up and they start shooting loads of nets, and the fishermen we work with will go right out there and say, hey, what are you doing? No, we do it this way. And I think that's really nice that you have this amazing level, I guess, of self-regulation. So in Lyme, touch wood, we are very fortunate to have a really good enforcement and monitoring regime through fishermen and also the kind of competent authority. That said, I do work with other fishing communities, particularly in Scotland, where there are marine protected areas that have been put in place for a long time that are subject to illegal fishing pretty much every week. It's very open, everyone knows it's happening. And with Marine Scotland having, you know, under 5 boats for the entirety of Scotland to do monitoring and enforcement, even, you know, for blue and other communities we work with, they go out and actually capture the illegal fishing happening. And it's very rare, I think, basically non-existent, that you get a kind of result in terms of taking people to court. So depends on where you are. England has a very good system, I would say. So lessons to be learned there as well in terms of how you enforce these kind of things.
I think it's a really important thing to talk about. I mean, we all agree here that, you know, bottom up and public consultation and all is needed. But like, if you don't have the enforcement, if people are being brought to court and given, you know, derisory fines, it does undermine a lot of the support, I think. And it's an important leg of the stool.
Yeah, completely. And monitoring, well, enforcement, but also monitoring. You know, we've been monitoring Lyme Bay for 10 years. It's one of the best monitored MPAs, and we have to fight every year to get more funding. But it's that funding that shows fishermen benefit, livelihoods are being improved. You know, this is what happens when you protect. So just getting that funding to continue that level of research to be able to say it's the MPA or it's the storm that happened last year that has meant that this happens, or climate change is so important. You know, these MPAs are for life. You need long-term funding. Yeah,
thank you for that. Ruth, I'll go to you now. I know you could, by all means, come in on a previous comment, but there's also a question here from Dolph, who is asking, do you envisage more public engagement after the end of this consultation? He's saying that the engagement to date has been very small. And he says, I take Minister Noonan's point about meeting coastal communities for 2 weeks, but this is inadequate. And I suppose there will need to be an awful lot more engagement on this issue, I think.
I'll just unmute myself. Yeah, that kind of ties into why I had my hand raised, because when I was scrolling through the comments, I saw there seems to be quite a lot of anger about the pace of the process so far. People saying this is urgent, why aren't we doing things more quickly? I just, what I wanted to say, following on from what Oliver said, is that I have a huge amount of respect for the Marine Protected Area team within the government, because they are taking things step by step, because they are really listening to what we have stressed in the report about the importance of the process. And one example I wanted to give for the importance of this is, so the marine, under the Habitats Directive, the marine special areas of conservation, or even terrestrial special areas of conservation, but marine special areas of conservation.
Oh, we've lost Ruth.
It has in place,
Hello,
tiny
Ruth,
percentage of them.
Sorry, Ruth, your connection broke there. Do you want to say the last thing again?
Yeah, so the marine special areas of conservation that have been designated under the Habitats Directive, there's a tiny percentage of them that have management plans in place. And so they are effectively paper parks. If we do not have the correct foundation in place, we are not going to have an effective marine protected area system in place. And that foundation takes time to build. I completely understand people's frustration, the sense of urgency. Why aren't we doing this more quickly? The foundation is built on relationships, and these relationships and involvement and engagement, that takes time. And it is an extraordinarily sensitive process. I spent 6 years in Scotland studying a really entrenched conflict on a very small island. And it is incredibly sensitive, and the foundation is incredibly important. So I would say, I understand your frustration, but also bear with the MPA team, because I really do think that they are proceeding in the right way on this.
Okay, thanks for that.
And it's not often that I will compliment the government.
We won't go there. I'm going to try and end on a positive note, and there's a question here from Barry Jean. I hope I'm pronouncing your name, Barry Jean, properly, and maybe it's for Jean-Luc. And it's which countries are having success in designation as well as management? So who's the gold standard out there?
That's a really good question. Australia was in a really good place around a decade and a half ago, because it implemented a rezoning process for the Great Barrier Reef that led to 30% of the reef being highly protected, actually fully protected from all fishing activities, developments, large-scale fishing, and tourism. I thought that was a real gold standard. I thought key to it was real high-level ministerial support. And I think that's where we've had problems in all MPAs in the UK, is if we have a poor vision backed by a lack of understanding of the science of the benefits of this within the highest levels of government, we're going to have problems. So Australia was the shining light. New Zealand also has been a shining light, and Canada's been catching up, as has the US. I don't think Europe, sadly, has anything to offer us, because I think, frankly, the fishing industry, the big fishing industry voices are too strong in making any MPAs work, sadly, to their own detriment. So England's got better, Scotland's getting there, but enforcement isn't as good as it should be, because we haven't got remote electronic monitoring on vessels, which I've responded to some of your respondents. But there are some really promising things in England and Northern Ireland, like lots of no trawl zones, being implemented in Sussex coast, which is the southeast of England, and Northern Ireland has got 9 MPAs. It's going to have no trawl zones in, and lobster enhancement zones as well, recognizing that within that process we can actually give back to the industry by having scientific fisheries enhancement zones for the industry. So there are real opportunities, to end on a more positive note, Padraig.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Morven.
I was going to say, I was in Sussex last week picking up on what Jean-Luc just said about this huge closure to trawling that has been brought in to restore kelp, seaweed and the seabed there. And I actually met some fishermen on Bognor Regis Beach by the kind of like pier with all the games going on. And they've been fishing there, their families, for 400 years. They gave up 10 years ago because the fishing was so bad. And the 3 of them said, in 2 weeks, we've rebought our boats and we're heading out, because this protection that has come here, it is a huge hope for us. We are completely excited to get out to sea, because we see a future now for our livelihoods, and that gave me the kind of spur to keep going for another week. And I just think it's so inspiring, and these big areas that can be protected and allow people to come back to sea and make a living from it is just really amazing. So yeah,
we need democracy of voices.
Yes, there is hope.
That's Ruth, you want to come in? I'll give the final words to you, Ruth.
Yeah, sorry, I just realized I didn't, and it's very frustrating when this happens, I didn't directly answer your participants' question on will there be more public engagement after the 30th of July. My hope is yes. If you look at the Marine Protected Area report, a massive focus on that is public engagement and getting people involved from the very, very start. So as Oliver said, like that there will be analysis of responses from the public engagement after that closes on the 30th of July. But the whole intention, as far as I understand it, is to create this really important foundation with a lot of public engagement. So I really, really hope that we will see more public engagement after the 30th of July.
Great. So thanks very much for that, Ruth. And so just to bring our event to a close, I really want to thank all of the panelists, Grace and Morven, Ruth and Jean-Luc. Your contributions have been absolutely wonderful. I want to thank the Minister for his words earlier, and the team that Ruth spoke about, the MPA team that are working behind the scenes on this. On a personal note, I feel it's a very exciting time to be working in this space. I do feel things are changing, but also we do have this rising pressure from climate change, which I think is emerging as one of the biggest threats we have to the ocean, as well as everything else. But a lot of opportunities ahead of us. And just as a final point, please do go to our website, iwt.ie. You'll see a lot of the information about the consultation and how to make a response, and what our views are on the submission. And do make sure you make a submission by the end of this month. So thank you very much again, everybody, for your participation this morning. I think it's been a wonderful discussion, and it will be online in a few days for people who have missed out. So tell your friends. Thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.